I released a Mac Mini with Apple Silicon M1 processor real-world and calibration review, and that video have been off the chart. Thank you for all of you who have viewed that video, who give the video a like, subscribe to my channel, comment, and give me feedback on the video. I greatly appreciate that. I have some more opportunities to run further testing on the system and also devise some more tests as well. So what I'm going to do is share with you some of those update findings, my thoughts about this computer in general, and also some clarification on the cables that I've used to do testing and everything. There is a lot to unpack, so let's get going. I'm Art, and Art is right. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. If you haven't seen my first Mac Mini review, I'll leave links right up here and in the description below. Many of the discussion here will build on the foundation of the previous review. There's a lot of information to cover. I'll leave timestamp to a different section so you can fast forward this review if you like. And lastly, I'm going to make this follow-up review different than the other reviews that are out there, as I mentioned in the previous one as well. I'm going to cover display connection. I've done some more testing on that. I want to clarify some of the cables that I've used, the refresh rate. I've done some more calibration on the display, and there are some solutions out there right now. And also, I've done more photo testing, and I have a lot of thoughts about that when you try to use a program such as Lightroom right now running on Rosetta 2. So let's jump into this. Starting out, what I'd like to quickly go over is my test system. It's the same one as the first review video. I have the Mac Pro with 12 core, 96 gigs of RAM running on 6 sticks. And it also has the Radeon Vega 2 video card with 32 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory, 2 terabyte SSD. I also have a 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro that has an 8-core upgrade processor. This is pretty much the max one that will run at 2.4 gigahertz, 32 gigabytes of memory. It has a Radeon Pro 5500M with the 8 gigabyte upgrade of GDDR6 and 2 terabyte SSD. And the last one, the test system, is a Mac Mini with M1 processor. This is also an upgraded system with 8 CPU core and 8 GPU core and 16 gigabyte of unified memory. One thing that I want to mention, I'll discuss this later on too, is that the Mac Pro has 6 times the memory of the Mac Mini, and the MacBook Pro laptop has 2 times the memory of the Mac Mini. And what we're going to talk about later on, I think, will enlighten a lot of things that will foretell what Apple will do with this processor. All right, first, what I like to do is talk about display connection, and there's 2 people who have made a comment, and there's a few other ones as well, but these are really great feedback. Jeff Barbos have mentioned that the dongle that I have could be the Apple old version one, similar to Andy Lowe, so thank you, both of you. And yes, I have the old version of a dongle, which is the reason why when I hook up the dongle using USB-C, I'm only able to get 4K 30 on HDMI. So what I have done for this video is gone out and spent a lot of money, got the update Apple dongle, got a BenQ dongle, got a $12 dongle on Amazon. We're going to talk about all those dongles in just a moment, but what you can do is 4K 60 using the correct dongle. So an update on that one. Let's talk about display connection quickly because there are a few things that I have found out. And on the Mac Mini, you can't really run dual Thunderbolt or dual USB-C. You can only use one. The nice thing about the Mac Mini is that it also has a HDMI out that is native. So you have to use one HDMI and the other one has to be a Thunderbolt or USB Type-C connection. So as you see there, USB-C or Thunderbolt with HDMI will work. If you use a dongle and the dongle plugs into the Thunderbolt port and you have another cable that's plugged into the other Thunderbolt port, it will not work. Only one will work at a time. And display daisy chaining obviously will not work on here. The refresh rate, most of these are going to depend on the dongle and depend on the display. And here's the finding of that. So I've added one more display to this lineup, and some of you may wonder, what is this widescreen display that I have here? This is the brand new BenQ PD3420Q. This is a 34-inch WQHD high definition display, and it's really gorgeous, isn't it? So this is the very first video that you're going to see anywhere with this display running in any video, in any consumer hands for that matter. So I got the test unit here, and this is also going to be the very first video with this display connected to a Mac Mini M1 processor. The very first one. So cool stuff there. All right. So a few things that I found out is that when we look at the second column here, we're going to see that I have purchased an Apple USB Type-C to HDMI that can run 4K 60, a BenQ USB Type-C to HDMI 4K 60, and also a Uni one from Amazon. So there's a big price difference between all of them, and I'd like to share with you the dongles that I've got. So The two Apple dongles look exactly the same. So there's the older version that can only run 4K 30, and there's a new version that can run 4K 60. So the thing is this, if you're getting these from Apple or from Best Buy or any big box retailer, most of the time you're going to be able to get the latest version. But if you can, I also put the model number on there as well. So the old one, the model number of it is A1621. The new one, the model number is A2119. So you want to keep an eye out for that if you're getting these to verify you're not getting the old one and you want to use a new one for that. But again, they look exactly the same. And it is fairly pricey at $69. But the nice thing about it is that in addition to the HDMI, it also has a USB Type A and a port for a USB Type-C, so you can plug in and power your device. This is not so much important for a Mac Mini like this. However, if you run on the new Apple laptop with M1 processors, the Apple MacBook Air or 13-inch MacBook Pro using M1, the ports are going to be scarce on that one, and getting these may be worth it for that. I've also spent $49 and got this BenQ USB-C to HDMI. This one can do 4K 60 as well. And again, it doesn't have any additional ports other than HDMI. And to be honest with you, I will probably go with the Amazon option. This cable by Uni is literally just $12. And it's pretty much USB Type-C to HDMI. Again, this will work great on the Mac Mini. However, if you have a laptop with limited ports and you do need to connect a lot of devices, I may look into the Apple one for that. A couple of things about the USB Type-C and Thunderbolt cable that I mentioned in the first video is that I have tested them both with a Thunderbolt cable. This is an Apple Thunderbolt cable that has implemented over USB Type-C on both ends. And I've also tested over a USB Type-C cable that has USB Type-C connector on both ends as well. The last cable I want to mention here is a USB Type-C to DisplayPort cable that I've used this to do testing on. This one will do 4K 60 on other displays. However, it won't really do it on the Mac Mini or Apple M1 right now. So that could be a limitation of the device. I'm not 100% sure. Again, we're still finding out what's really going on at the moment. But I'll leave a link to all of these cables in the description below if you'd like to check them out too. Okay, so what are some of the findings? So if you use a dongle that's capable of doing 4K 60, there won't be any problems at all running two display of 4K 60. So one of them can run native on HDMI. And if you have another display that is not capable of doing 4K 60 using, for example, a Thunderbolt to Thunderbolt or a USB-C to USB-C, then obviously you may have to look into getting a dongle, which is just $12 more. It's really not a big deal at all. And on BenQ PD3420Q, I'm able to run 3440 at 1440 resolution at 60 Hz without any problem. This is using the native USB Type-C cable. If you're looking to get any BenQ displays to run with the Apple M1 system, I still think that it is a great buy, especially if you are thinking about getting the PD line. I think the PD line displays are going to fit in really well with these M1 processor Mac. If you're using the SW displays without a full running version of Palette Master Element, I can't check yet whether HDMI is going to cause some validation failure or not. But for the time being, the SW displays will also link up and hook up to these Mac with the M1 processor just fine as well. One thing interesting I find about the SW321C and the PD3220U is that both of these displays are full 4K and they have power delivery features. I'm not sure if power delivery have anything to do with it or not, or is it conflicting with the 4K output? Obviously, the Mac Mini doesn't really require any power delivery, but that seems to be the common trend when you use a native Thunderbolt or USB-C connector that's preventing it from running 4K 60. Again, the dongles, the USB to HDMI dongle will bypass that, and also on the PD3420Q, because it is not a full 4K display, I'm able to run it and also get 60 Hz over the native USB Type-C connection. So there's something interesting going on there. And the PD3420Q is also able to do power delivery at 60 watts as well. So more testing needs to be done on that. Another thing I like to share with you is a Switch Res X screen capture. This is pretty much using the SW321C or the PD3220U. It's pretty much the same. You will see that it's not capable of doing 60 Hz until you scale this whole thing down to 2560 by 1440. At that point, you can then do 60 Hz refresh rate. So there's something preventing it natively from running higher than that. I'm not sure if that is a limitation cap on the machine itself, because obviously the dongles are able to bypass that. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Next up, bit depth. I was not able to confirm this in the previous review because Apple System Information no longer reports the color depth output. However, using a program called SwitchResX, I'm able to confirm that the Mac Mini is outputting 10-bit signal to the display. I'm fairly certain on the MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro running the M1 processor, the output signal is going to be 10-bit as well. If you have those devices you want to check for me, let me know in the comments. I would greatly appreciate that. But I think it would be very uncanny for Apple to step back on the bit depth output, on the laptop, considering the processors in this machine and on those machines are very similar to each other. Now let's talk about display calibration. There are some more things I found out about the Mac Mini M1 and calibration in general, and I'd like to share those findings with you. What I'd like to do first is really answer the question of, aren't BenQ displays already pre-calibrated from the factory? The answer to that is yes, they all are, especially the SW and the PD line. They go through a much stricter tolerance for calibration because these are pro color accurate displays. And aren't these going to produce color that are good enough already? It really depends. It really depends on the creative type that you do. The other thing too is depends on how critical you are with color. If you're doing printing, the signals that are coming out from our displays are not referenced. When the display is hooked up at the factory to run the calibration, the factory computers are outputting reference signal and is being calibrated to the reference signal. So the thing is that these displays are super color accurate. The problem is that our computers, the one that we have, are all outputting colors that are slightly different because of software modification, because of drivers running on top of there. So the best way to get the greatest color accuracy on your display is to run a calibration on it. So think of calibration as doing a pairing process, pairing the computer that you have to the display that you have so that the color output is as accurate as possible. In BenQ Palette Master Element, there's no change. However, in X-Rite i1 Profiler and i1 Studio, something interesting have happened. I've tried to launch a program and it will bounce on the dock a few times and pretty much not launch. If you try to launch it again, macOS will tell you that the program has crashed and would you like to relaunch it? If you click on relaunch, it goes to the same loop again. So I've tried uninstalling, reinstalling the program. That doesn't really help with anything. And another thing to note about the X-Rite software too is that even though you could launch a program, you can't really go in to calibrate the display anyway, similar to the findings that I have earlier. So it's just a matter of time at this point before all these companies release these code software that will work with the device that you have and also calibrate these displays natively. The one software though that I was able to get to work and produce a fairly decent result is the Spider X. The version that I have is the Elite. The program does require Rosetta 2. It will launch and it will calibrate. However, it won't recognize the display. So anytime you plug in any display at all, it will show as display XXX-X. If you have two displays, trying to calibrate one or the other is going to be extremely confusing and difficult to do. So the best thing to do for that is to unplug one display and just calibrate one at a time if you have the Spider X Elite. The result so far from the calibration is pretty good tonal separation. I don't see the color shift in the shadow areas, and this is doing testing on multiple different displays already. Some of you that may own a Spider X Pro may ask, will this work? My guess is that yes, because the Pro and Elite uses the same code-based software. If you own the Spider 4 or 5, you have to run testing on that one. I don't have those devices to really run testing in my studio. The other thing I want to mention too is that if you don't own a calibration device already, I would just wait. Or if you own a device from X-Rite, just wait for the time being. It's a matter of when they're going to release these update binaries that will run natively on the M1 processor and not a matter of if they're going to release it. Obviously, with the Spider software, you can calibrate now. However, it still doesn't recognize the display fully. And from my years of testing, I can tell you that the X-Rite i1 Display Pro and the i1 Display Pro Plus tend to produce a much better profile and tonal gradation compared to Spider devices that I've seen in the past. Now let's talk about benchmark. What we're going to do is focus on photography. One of the comments that I received from Stefan Huber is that he had the exact same computer, a Nikon D850, and he tried to export 100 RAW files and he was able to get 2 minutes and 22 seconds. And he made me think a little bit. But one of the things I can tell you right now is that 100 RAW files from a D850, not all of them are going to be equal. What you have to do when you run a test like this is to keep those 100 files the same throughout every single system. This way you're running the equal or equivalent benchmark. Because if you have files, for example, from a D850 that has a lot more darker tones on all of them, those files are going to require more time for it to be compressed to JPEG because darker tones are much harder to compress than the lighter tones. So obviously the picture that you have is going to drastically change the way how that compression and the timing will work. The thing that I'm doing here is keeping everything the same. All right, that being said, this is a shot from my last review video, and this is a one-to-one preview generated using 100 raw file from Nikon D850 45 megapixel file, and this is running on Rosetta 2 on the Mac Mini M1 right now. So you can see the result there. Mac Pro was able to get it done in 2 minutes, MacBook Pro in 3 minutes 24 seconds, and the Mac Mini was able to do it in 4 minutes 13 seconds. So what I have done though on the export for those 100 files to an 8x12 JPEG is that I've actually done a retest based on his comments, and I found out some interesting thing is that there was an anomaly in my 16-inch MacBook Pro. So you can see there the second line down, that 3 minutes 43 seconds, that is the anomaly test. So the Mac Pro result remains the same, 2 minutes 36 seconds for exporting 100 raw files to JPEG using Lightroom. The 16-inch MacBook Pro was able to do it on the retest in 3 minutes 2 seconds, and the Mac Mini, again, the test was at 3 minutes 15 seconds. But you can see right now that the Mac Mini is within the hair of the 16-inch MacBook Pro that costs twice as much, and it's really close to the 2019 MacBook Pro, the 12-core that costs 8 times as much. So I have been thinking, and this test is the new one that I've done, rather than doing just 100 raw file export tests and import run-to-one preview, what I have done is do a 1K test. Putting together 1,000 raw files from Nikon D850 from a recent wedding I've shot, I've import them rendering one-to-one, time this, and also export them to full-size JPEG and time this as well. And let's see the result, what we're able to find. I think that this is a more realistic real-world representation, especially for someone like me who is a wedding event shooter. Many times I'll come back with thousands of files, and it would not be surprising for me to be exporting 1,000 files to a client, especially for events that run multiple days. So here's the result. On the Mac Pro, I'm able to render one-to-one preview on import for those files in 13 minutes and 36 seconds. On the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, it is 26 minutes and 43 seconds, so almost double there. And on the Mac Mini M1, not quite double the MacBook Pro, but is almost 3 times what the Mac Pro is taking, 38 minutes and 39 seconds. So obviously we see that if you're really running Lightroom with heavy workload right now, with the program running on Rosetta, not running native on the system, this is definitely not a good system for you to really jump into just yet because it takes much longer. Now let's talk about the 1,000 file or 1K export. So for 1K export, Mac Pro was able to finish the export in 14 minutes and 55 seconds. MacBook Pro took about double amount of time, 30 minutes and 43 seconds, while the Mac Mini again took 38 minutes and 47 seconds. So the Mac Mini does take more time to export. Granted, this is not running native on the system yet, but this got me thinking a little bit. So what I have done is some extrapolation. So what we see on the top there on the green bar are the actual time exporting these 1,000 files for all these devices, and the graph below, the second line in blue, is the extrapolation data. So what I have done is calculate the time that it takes to export 100 files into seconds, multiply that by 10 so that we get the equivalent of exporting 1,000 files, and we get to see the result that's quite interesting. I think the more stabilizing result is the one with the MacBook Pro in the middle there, where the extrapolated data and the actual exported time is pretty much within range. What surprised me though was the Mac Pro 2019 was able to export those files in less amount of time. My speculation on this would be that the system is able to cool it faster, and the turbo boost along with the hyper threading is able to power up all the cores to speed up the exporting process. What's disappointing for me though was the Mac Mini with the M1 processor. Based on the extrapolation data, it was supposed to be able to export all those files in 32 minutes and 50 seconds just about. However, in reality, it took 38 minutes and 47 seconds. So what is really happening there? I have some thoughts on that. So even though the Mac Mini has a fan that runs full time on the system, I've been looking at the CPU chart, and something interesting come up in my testing. So the number one there, what you see on those peaks, that is when the Mac Mini was running at full power for the first 20 minutes. Lightroom was able to use 80% to 90% of the computing power on the Mac Mini. Later on though, about 20 minutes in, what happened is you see that there is a sharp drop in the graph there. And at that point, the max that Lightroom was able to use or utilize was around 70% at most. Most of the time it's hovering around 65 or so. So that is something interesting there. And my guess is that because the system is running for quite some time and heat up, so the processor have to really slow down, or what we call thermal throttling, to bring the speed down in order to keep the heat within range. And that is really my big guess on here, what's happening right now. The other thing too is that in the beginning, you will see in the middle chart there that the CPU is generally running fully all the time. This is pretty much the first 20 minutes. When you get to the last 20 minutes of the export, you start to see the CPU core bouncing around. My understanding is that those 4 graphs that are high all the time are the higher performance core, while the low performance core are the ones that are peaking up every now and then to really max up and meet up with the performance of the higher performance core. So that's something interesting there on the Mac Mini. And I think that in the next generation processor, or in a more pro machine that has a lot more thermal envelope, I think that we're going to see a much better performance. But as of now, running Lightroom on this system is not something that I would necessarily consider just yet. Another thing too that I want to mention is that I've also loaded in a whole bunch of my files that are panorama. When we're talking about, hundreds of megapixels stitched together from D850 and D810 into a panorama, and pretty much Lightroom on the Mac Mini just pretty much struggled to render preview. It struggles to do any type of advanced adjustments. So you can't really apply too many on them before the systems start to choke up. Again, if you use Lightroom, if you use heavy processor intensive tasks with Lightroom that's not running natively on Rosetta yet, I would just hold off on buying any of the Apple M1 processor for the time being. If you need to buy a new computer today, the Apple Intel desktop are going to be the one to look at for the time being until a newer, better processor is released. I've also gone in and run a Blackmagic disk speed test, and pretty much what I find interesting about this whole thing is that the Mac Pro and MacBook Pro, they're pretty much within range of each other. The interesting thing about the Mac Pro is that is using 2 blade of 1 terabyte SSD and is running that in RAID 0 to get the performance that you're seeing there. While the Mac Mini is pretty much just the SSD soldered onto the board itself, and it was able to do a write of 3,162 megabytes per second, which is really mind-blowing. And that is faster than my Mac Pro that costs 8 times as much, and is also faster than my MacBook Pro. The read, though, is pretty much within line of both of them, so it's kind of like a give and take thing. I wish I could write faster on my MacBook Pro, but, ho-hum, it's okay. So one of the things that Jeff Barbos mentioned was that, it's really interesting to see the result that you have. My guess is that once the app, such as Lightroom is running native on the system, you're not really going to see that big of an improvement when you try to export JPEG, such as what I'm showing now, because his thought is that currently when I'm doing the JPEG export is already dipping down into the core M1 processor itself, very similar to the T2 helping out on the 16-inch MacBook Pro with image processing and everything. So it's a very interesting finding. I'm not really sure if that's going to be the case or not, but something though that I find interesting is that the compressor 4K export. This is, I think, giving us a really good indicator of what we may be able to expect out of this machine in reality once the app runs native on here. And if you take a look at this, compressor is an Apple program that runs with Final Cut Pro. This is already running native on the M1 processor, and we're still seeing the time gap between the Mac Mini M1 and the Mac Pro. So my speculation would be that even after Adobe have gone in and optimized Lightroom to run on the M1 processor, what you're going to get is a better usability throughout the entire program in general of Lightroom. But when it comes to exporting tasks, you may not see that big of an improvement. And it may be just, for example, 1.25 or 1.5% improvement. It's not necessarily going to be the double improvement game that we're actually thinking of. So here are some of my final thoughts. Let's quickly go back and look at my test system. We have the Mac Pro that costs 8 times as much as the M1. We have the MacBook Pro that costs twice as much as the M1. And let's take a look at the memory quickly. The Mac Pro has 6 times the amount of memory the M1 have. MacBook Pro, twice the amount of memory. And from the result that we can see so far, the M1 edged really closely to these 2 computers, these 2 Intel computers. So I think that if this was a marathon or something like that, if this was a competition, I'd be very worried if I'm the Mac Pro or the MacBook Pro running an Intel processor. And this just really tells you that this is a really first great iteration for Apple. I think is ready for majority of the mainstream user. I don't think it's actually ready for the pro users quite yet. The other thing too is let's take a look at the processors. So for the Intel machine, we're always looking at the core count. We're always looking at the actual frequency itself and how much it can turbo boost to. And you can see that on the Mac Pro and the MacBook Pro. However, on the Apple M1, it just says Apple M1 with 8 cores. That's pretty much it. There's no frequency. Obviously, the way how we see these chips are going to be different as well, because on the M1, from 8 of those cores, 4 of them are the low power one, and the other 4 are the high power one that can run longer, that are meant for like, heavy intensive tasks, where the 4 lower power one or the little cores will come in to help with the higher power cores. So we're looking at a paradigm that's different, but I think that Apple is going to change the paradigm of how we think about memory on the Pro machine and how we think about processor speed in computer systems in general. One more thing is I wanted to tie in my thoughts about Rosetta 2 along with the thoughts that I mentioned earlier about Adobe and Lightroom, how much of an improvement we're really going to get when the code really run natively on the system. And the thing is this, majority of apps right now runs amazingly well on Rosetta 2. So I'm really wondering how much of an incentive developers are going to have to really go in and update the code base to run natively on the Apple Silicon binary, or because they run so well already, they're just going to take their time. That's something that I am kind of worried about as a pro, because majority of the pro apps right now haven't been ported over. There are some really great notable examples that have ported their apps over already, but many of the major ones are still pretty much running on Rosetta 2. So my final thoughts on this is pretty much, if you're a photographer, if you need Lightroom, if you need Capture One, just wait to the next generation or until the apps are able to run natively on the system. If you need calibration, again, the best thing that you can do is to wait. If you're just using these systems casually on a daily basis, just browsing the web, if you're just a casual user or you use this for word processing and everything, I think that these are going to be amazing systems that you can use, especially for Zoom calls and everything else. I hope that you find this Apple M1 follow-up review that focus heavily on photography workflow helpful. If you have any questions about this, leave them in the comment section below. Give this video a like, subscribe if you're new, hit on the bell to be notified every time I upload great new contents like this, including an unboxing of the PD3420Q and also a full review of it that will be coming on my channel. And until next time, Art is right.